The dog wasn't supposed to survive the night. That was what the vet tech said when she called the Kenora detachment, just past 11 on a Thursday in February, the kind of February that Ontario saves for when it really wants to make a point. Wind chill -38. Snow so dry it squeaked under boots like something living. She said they'd found him under the loading dock behind the feed store on Lakeview Drive, curled into himself the way animals do when they've given up on warmth and started negotiating with something else entirely. Nobody at the detachment wanted to deal with it. It was late. It was cold. There were 3 active calls on the board, and the coffee machine had been broken since Tuesday. But the desk sergeant made 1 phone call, because there was really only 1 person in Kenora who took in strays without being asked. Retired Chief Petty Officer Hal Dempsey answered on the 2nd ring, which surprised no one who knew him. Hal didn't sleep much anymore. Hadn't, not really, since coming back from his last rotation 14 months ago. And not really since Carol died 2 years before that, though he never quite put it in those terms. He would say he was a light sleeper. He would say the house made sounds at night. He would say a lot of things that weren't quite the thing he meant. He said he'd go. The drive took 11 minutes. Hal knew because he counted intersections the way he'd once counted boot strikes down a corridor in Kandahar. Not from anxiety, he would tell himself, just from habit. The truck's heater was working at about 60% capacity, and he'd been meaning to get that looked at since October, which was now 4 months ago, which was the kind of thing that happened when you lived alone. And there was no one to say, "Have you called the mechanic yet?" while standing in the kitchen doorway, with a mug in both hands the way Carol used to. He didn't let himself think about that for long. The vet tech, a young woman named Darcy, who looked about 22 but was probably older, met him in the parking lot with a flashlight and a look on her face that said she'd already made her peace with how this night was going to end. "He's small," she said. "Maybe 8 weeks. Shepherd mix, I think. Hard to tell how bad. Hypothermia. Some kind of blunt trauma to the left hip. Might be old, might be recent. Dehydrated." She paused. "He's fighting, though. I'll give him that." Hal followed her inside. The puppy was in a kennel lined with heating pads and old towels, and he was, in fact, fighting. Trembling so hard, the whole wireframe of the kennel seemed to vibrate with him. His eyes glassy but tracking, his nose working even through whatever was happening to the rest of him. He was mostly black and tan. 1 ear stood straight up, the other folded at the tip like it hadn't made its mind up yet. Hal crouched down and said nothing for a long moment. He'd had a dog once, a Belgian Malinois named Strider, call sign and all, who'd worked alongside him for 3 years with the kind of partnership that doesn't translate well into civilian language. You couldn't explain it at dinner parties. Or to a grief counselor, without watching people's faces do that thing where they were listening, but not quite understanding. Strider had been killed in action. That was the phrase. There was a formal letter and a commendation and a folded flag that Hal kept in the closet of the spare bedroom. And none of it had ever felt like enough, and none of it had ever felt like the right shape for what he'd actually lost. He hadn't had a dog since. "What happens if I don't take him?" Hal asked. Darcy was quiet for a moment. "We don't have the capacity for overnight critical care. We'd have to make a decision before morning." Hal looked at the puppy. The puppy looked back at him, or looked in his direction anyway. It was hard to tell how much he was actually seeing. "Fine," Hal said. "Give me what I need." The first 3 nights were the kind that compressed time. Hal slept on the couch because the spare bedroom felt too far away. He set alarms every 90 minutes. He learned to read the puppy's breathing the way he'd once read terrain. Small signs, changes in pattern, the difference between settled and distressed. The puppy had no name yet. Hal wasn't naming something he wasn't sure would make it. By the 4th morning, the puppy ate on his own. By the 5th, he was standing. By the 6th, he'd managed to climb onto the couch beside Hal at 4:30 in the morning, then sit back and survey the living room with an expression of complete ownership. Ears forward, chin lifted, as though he'd just conducted a thorough inspection and found the premises acceptable. Hal looked at him. "Don't get comfortable," he said. The puppy yawned. Hal hadn't laughed in a long time, not genuinely, not the kind that came from somewhere real rather than from politeness or performance. But something happened in his chest right then that he didn't have a word for, and it wasn't nothing. He called him Frost, because of the night they'd met, and because it suited the particular silver-tipped quality of his black fur in the morning light, and because Hal had always been practical about naming things. Frost talked, not in any way that required explanation to a veterinarian or a behaviorist. He made no sounds that a dog couldn't make, but he made them constantly and deliberately, and with what could only be described as intent. A low grumble when his breakfast was late, a series of escalating murmurs when Hal put on his coat to go out, a full, opinionated monologue every time the neighbor's car alarm went off at 7 in the morning, which it did 3 times a week with a consistency that suggested the neighbor had also given up on fixing things. Hal started talking back. This happened gradually, in the way that most true things happen. Not as a decision, but as a slow erosion of the silence he'd built around himself since Carol, since Strider, since the last time he'd had someone to talk to in a way that mattered. "You're doing it again," he'd say over his coffee, while Frost sat on the kitchen floor and delivered some long-winded opinion about the morning. "I can hear you. I'm standing right here." Frost would look at him with enormous patience and continue. What Hal didn't say, what he wouldn't have known how to say even if he'd wanted to, was that the talking helped. That the house had felt, for 2 years, like a place where sound went to disappear. That he'd spent 14 months back on Canadian soil, and had yet to figure out what he was supposed to be doing here, in this town, in this house with Carol's reading glasses still on the nightstand, Strider's old harness still hanging on the hook by the back door, because he'd never managed to decide what to do with it. He didn't say any of that. He just answered the dog. It was a Thursday in late March when Nolan Bryce knocked on the door, which was unusual because nobody knocked on Hal's door. Kenora was a small town, but Hal had made himself smaller within it, a deliberate contraction that most people respected, because he was the sort of man whose solitude looked intentional rather than sad. Nolan was 44, broad across the shoulders in the way that suggested either genetics or physical labor or both, and he had the particular stillness about him that Hal recognized from his own mirror, the kind that came from learning to take up less space than you occupied, to breathe quietly in rooms where the air felt thin. He'd served with the Royal Canadian Regiment, 2 tours. He'd been back for 3 years, and he worked now at the boat repair yard on the lake, and he came to work early and left late, and he had, in the 2 years since Hal had been his neighbor, said approximately 40 words to him in total. He was holding a casserole dish covered in foil. "My wife made too much," Nolan said. "Elaine, she makes too much of everything." A pause. "She says you probably don't eat right." Hal looked at him for a moment. "Is that what she says? She's not wrong, usually." Hal stepped back from the door. It wasn't an invitation exactly, more of a reduction in resistance. Frost appeared from somewhere in the living room and stood in the hallway, and looked at Nolan with absolute focus, head tilted, the way he tilted it when he was trying to work something out. Nolan looked down at him. Something in his expression changed, some tightening around the eyes, some adjustment that wasn't quite a wince. "Shepherd mix," he said. "More or less how old? About 4 months now." Nolan crouched down slowly, setting the casserole dish on the hallway floor, and held out one hand. Frost sniffed it with great seriousness, then sat down and began to talk, a long, soft murmur that started low and wound upward like a question. Nolan didn't laugh. He looked at the dog the way you look at something that said something you weren't expecting. "What's he doing?" he asked. "He does that," Hal said. "Nobody knows what he's saying. He doesn't seem to care." Nolan was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "My dog used to do that." He stood up. "I should go. Elaine will be wondering." He picked up the casserole dish, then seemed to remember and handed it to Hal. "You were with the SEALs," Nolan said. It wasn't quite a question. "Naval Special Operations." Nolan nodded. "I heard." There was a pause between them that was the particular kind of silence that only exists between people who've been in situations where speaking could get you killed, a silence that had a shape to it, a texture. "Thursday nights," Hal said. "If you wanted to come by, I usually just sit. There's generally too much coffee." Nolan looked at him. Frost murmured from somewhere around knee-height. "Maybe," Nolan said. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. Elaine Bryce was a practical woman with a great quantity of warmth that she deployed without sentimentality, the way a good mechanic uses the right tool. efficiently and without unnecessary ceremony. She started including Hal in the Thursday dinners after the 4th week, which she announced by appearing at his door at 5:30 with a bottle of rye, and the information that it was too cold to be eating alone, and that she'd made enough shepherd's pie for 3, and would he please come before it dried out in the oven. Hal came. Frost came too, because Frost was not the kind of dog who accepted being left behind with any degree of grace. He sat under the table at the Bryce kitchen and delivered quiet commentary on the meal, and Elaine, who had grown up with dogs and had the easy confidence around them that comes from years of shared living, talked to him throughout dinner as naturally as she talked to anyone else, asking him questions and responding to his answers as though he'd said something perfectly sensible. "He thinks the shepherd's pie needs something," she said at one point. "He thinks everything needs something," Hal said. "He's very particular. He's right about the shepherd's pie. I forgot the Worcestershire." Nolan looked between his wife and the dog, and then at Hal, and there was something in his eyes. Something careful and a little raw that Hal recognized from a long distance because he'd seen it in his own face. He didn't say anything about it. Not yet. The story came out on a Tuesday, unexpectedly, the way true things usually do. Hal and Nolan were at the boatyard after hours. Nolan had been walking him through the repair on Hal's old aluminum that had been sitting in his garage since Carol had been alive, and they'd used it summers on Lake of the Woods, back before summers felt like something that happened to other people. Frost was investigating a corner of the workshop with the methodical attention he brought to all investigations, murmuring quietly to himself. Nolan was sanding something that didn't need sanding anymore. He'd been sanding for about 10 minutes. His name was Gunner, Nolan said. Hal looked up. He was a lab mix, 10 years old. Nolan kept sanding. "We got him before my first tour. He was Elaine's really to start, but dogs, you know how it is. They pick somebody. They do." Hal said. "He picked me." Nolan set down the sandpaper. "He died 6 weeks after I got back from my second tour. 6 weeks. The vet said it was his heart." A pause. Elaine said he'd been waiting, that he wouldn't go until I came home. The workshop, the lake ice was shifting, a low structural groan that carried for miles on cold nights in the Kenora Basin. "I haven't been able to." Nolan stopped, started again. "We've talked about getting another dog. Elaine wants to. She says it would help." He looked at his hands. "I keep thinking that if we get another one and if something happens again on a call-out with the reserve unit, or if," he didn't finish. "I don't know if it's fair to the dog." Frost had stopped investigating. He was standing at Nolan's feet, looking up at him, and he made a sound that was different from his usual commentary, softer, lower, something that sat at the bottom of the register and just stayed there, patient and present. Nolan looked down at him. "He does that," Hal said again. But his voice was different this time. He thought about Strider, about the last morning he'd seen him, the way Strider had walked with him to the briefing, ears up, that loose-limbed readiness that never left him. He thought about the letter, the commendation, the harness on the hook. "I had a dog," Hal said, "in theater. Strider." He picked up a rag, turned it over in his hands. "He didn't come back. And I thought the same thing, that it wasn't fair to do it again, to start something like that and then have it end that way." Nolan was very still. "And then some kid found this one frozen under a loading dock." Hal looked at Frost, and here we are. Frost turned and looked at Hal. He made a single, quiet sound, the kind that didn't need translation. "I don't know if it's fair," Hal said. "I think maybe that's not really the right question." Nolan was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up the sandpaper again, turned it over once and set it down. "Elaine's found a litter," he said. "In Dryden, a lab cross. She's been not mentioning it for about 3 weeks." "Sounds like Elaine," Hal said. "She's terrible at not mentioning things, she is." Another silence, the good kind, the kind that had weight and warmth in it. "I'll think about it," Nolan said. April came in slowly, the ice on the lake pulling back from the shores like something reconsidering its position. Hal started running again in the mornings. Not the punishing distances of his operational years, just the lake road, just enough to feel the cold air working properly in his lungs. Frost came with him, which was less running, and more a highly irregular series of sprints and investigations, and sudden stops to address something of great importance in the underbrush. He had started sleeping better. He noticed it the way you notice a pain has stopped. Not when it goes, but later, when you realize you haven't thought about it for a while. He was waking at 4:30 instead of 2. He was eating meals at actual meal times. Small adjustments, small recalibrations. The kind of thing that looks like nothing from the outside, and from the inside looks like everything. There was a morning in mid-April when he took Carol's reading glasses off the nightstand. He stood at the dresser for a long time, holding them, those particular glasses with the tortoiseshell frames that she'd gotten in Halifax the summer they'd driven out, the ones she'd worn pushed up on her head more often than on her face. And he thought about putting them in a drawer. He put them in a drawer. It wasn't forgetting. He understood that now, in a way he hadn't when he'd come home and found the house arranged exactly as she'd left it, and told himself that keeping things in place was respect, when really it was fear. Fear that if he moved anything, the last version of her that existed in the rooms would rearrange itself into something he couldn't recognize. But memory didn't live in objects. He knew that. He'd learned it with Strider. If he was honest, the harness on the hook had never once made the absence smaller. The absence was its own country, and you learned to live near it without living inside it. Frost jumped onto the bed and sat at the foot of it and watched him put the glasses in the drawer, with the expression of a dog who has followed every step of an argument and arrived at his own conclusion. "Don't say anything," Hal told him. Frost said something. The call about the litter in Dryden came from Elaine on a Friday afternoon, delivered with the particular tone of someone who has been waiting a very long time to make a phone call, and is trying not to sound like it. "There's a black female," she said, with a white patch on her chest like a star. Nolan saw her picture. There was a pause on the line. "Is he going?" Hal asked. "He's thinking about it. He's been thinking about it since February." "I know," Elaine said. "I know." And then, "Would you come?" "If he goes." He'd never ask. Hal looked at Frost, who was sitting on the kitchen floor conducting some low-volume investigation into his own opinions. "Saturday?" Hal said. Saturday. The drive to Dryden was 2 hours through boreal country that in late April was caught between seasons. Snow still in the deep shade of the spruce, mud everywhere else, the birches just beginning their first tentative greenness. Nolan drove. Hal sat in the passenger seat. Frost sat in the back and issued running commentary that Nolan, after about 40 minutes, began addressing directly. "I hear you," Nolan said to the dog. "I'm thinking." Frost said more. "I know," Nolan said. Hal looked out the window and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The litter was in a farmhouse outside of Dryden. 7 puppies in a whelping box in a warm kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dog, and whatever was in the slow cooker on the counter. The farmer was a woman in her 60s named. She pointed them out one by one, and there, at the back of the box, was the black female with the star on her chest. She was sitting very upright, watching the room with an alert, considering expression, and when Nolan crouched down at the side of the whelping box, she walked directly to him. None of the tumbling distraction of her siblings. Just a straight line, purposeful, and put both front paws on the edge of the box and looked up at him. Nolan didn't move for a long moment. Frost, who was on his lead beside Hal, made the sound he'd made in the workshop that night, low and sustained and patient. Nolan reached out and picked the puppy up carefully, and she put her chin on his collarbone with the easy certainty of something that has arrived exactly where it meant to be. The drive home was quieter, but a different kind of quiet. Nolan's new dog. He said on the highway that he was going to call her Nova, because Elaine had liked the name, and also because it suited the star on her chest. Slept in a blanket on the back seat. Frost lay beside her at a careful distance, chin on the seat, watching her breathe the way he'd once, 4 months ago, been watched himself. "Thank you for coming," Nolan said at some point between Vermilion Bay and Dryden Junction. "You'd have gone anyway," Hal said. "Maybe." A pause. "Probably. Definitely." Nolan almost smiled. "You don't know that. I've been watching you think about it for 2 months. You just needed someone in the passenger seat." Another stretch of highway. The light through the spruce was going gold in that particular way of northern April evenings, long and slanted, making ordinary things look like they'd been reconsidered. Carol would have liked Frost, Hal said, and then paused, slightly surprised at himself, because he didn't usually say Carol's name in present tense anymore, didn't usually let himself imagine what she would have thought of things that happened after her. But it didn't feel wrong. That was the surprising part. It felt like the glasses in the drawer, not erasure, not replacement, just a different kind of holding. "Tell me about her," Nolan said. So Hal did. He talked about Carol for the rest of the drive, about how she'd been the one who could fix anything in the house, who'd kept a running list of all the things he'd been meaning to do, who'd said, "Have you called the mechanic yet?" in the kitchen doorway with a mug in both hands, and who had loved Lake of the Woods the way some people love a person, with loyalty and particularity, and a willingness to be made speechless by it every summer without embarrassment. And he talked about Strider. He'd never talked about Strider to anyone who hadn't been there, and it was different than he'd expected. Not the clean grief he'd braced for, but something more complicated and also more bearable. The way telling a story returns it to being a story instead of a wound. Nolan listened. He asked questions. He told Hal about Gunnar in return. Not the death, but the years before it, the particular shape of the friendship, the way 10 years of sharing a life with a dog leaves you permanently rewritten. In the back seat, Frost murmured quietly and Nova slept. May came. The boat went back in the water. Hal took it out on a morning in the 3rd week. A Tuesday, the lake glassy the way it gets when the air and water haven't quite agreed on temperature, and everything sits very still and bright. He brought Frost, who stood at the bow with his ears forward, and his posture absolutely convinced that navigating was a dog's job, and he was equal to it. He thought about Strider on the water. He thought about Carol, who used to sit in the stern with a book she wouldn't read because the lake kept interrupting her. He let himself think about both of them without flinching, without that specific bracing quality he'd carried for 2 years, like a man walking through a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. The lake was very wide and very clear, and the boreal shore ran in both directions without ending. Frost turned and looked at him and said something at considerable length. "I know," Hal said. He did know. That was the thing, he actually did. He couldn't have said exactly what had changed, or when, or what the mechanism had been. He could tell you about a dog frozen under a loading dock in February, and a neighbor at his door with a casserole dish, and a workshop conversation about a lab named Gunnar and a dog named Strider, and a drive to Dryden in April light with a new puppy sleeping in the back seat. He could give you the inventory without being able to name the alchemy. Some things didn't have to be explained to be true. He turned the boat north, into the morning, and Frost faced forward, ears up, talking steadily into the wind about something that couldn't wait.